Hello everyone, welcome again to the MOA Live Talks. I'm Dr. Heather Hatch and I'm joining here today from Victoria Park. So I'm sure many people who live here in London are familiar with the park. It's the site of many big festivals that we have throughout the year like Sunfest, Home Town and Country, Ribfest, International Food Fest. I'm sure I'm missing some other important festivals that all take place on the grounds here. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the archaeological work that we have done, or that has been done here at the park, and in order to sort of develop the park throughout its history. So this is actually probably the best historical archaeological site that we have in this city, so the best preserved. The history of the site goes back well beyond occupation of London itself as a city or a town. There's evidence of First Nations peoples who were living in this area, but then in the 1830s, 50s, so on, this was actually the site of a big military installation. So we've got, there has been a lot of archaeological work that's been done in the area that has sort of uncovered a lot of that past history of the city. And there are several plaques like this one that have been placed throughout the park that sort of give you a little bit of information about some of the work that's been done here and some of the historical finds. So I'm actually standing sort of out in front of the band house, or the bandstand. I don't know if you can see it a little bit in the background, but that was really the site of the first archaeological work that was done here. So that was built in about 1990, and there was some excavation, some survey work done in the area then, just to sort of get a sense of what might have been found here. And then as the city decided that with the aging infrastructure of the park in the mid-90s, that they wanted to redevelop this site completely as a park. They wanted to build new infrastructure to support the millions of visitors that come to this space to enjoy the different festivals and to make use of the park space. They developed a plan, and I believe, as I said in my talk on Monday, one of the things that drives archaeology in Ontario is development. So anytime you're looking at some sort of infrastructural project like redeveloping a park, for example, you have to do some archaeological work to find out what kinds of resources might be impacted by that development. So in this case, they worked with D.R. Poulton, which is a local firm. Dana Poulton is actually on the board of directors for the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, and he was involved in a lot of the work that was done here. Their company actually excavated on site here for almost 20 years, looking into the archaeological history of Victoria Park. So we're very lucky in the past to have had the loan of some exhibit material. Pardon the background noise. So I have some loan of exhibit material to put on an exhibit specifically exploring some of the sites in London, including Victoria Park, about 4 years ago in the galleries. But today we're here on site. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of the history of the park itself. I've got some notes here because I'm not going to remember all of this. This is just sort of a very condensed, generalized history. And then to talk a little bit about some of the archaeological finds that support our knowledge and understanding of what was happening here on site. So, back in 1836, there was a rebellion in Upper Canada, sort of the Ontario area, that was called, in fact, the Upper Canada Rebellion, or William Lyon Mackenzie Uprising. And I asked a PhD friend of mine who has her doctorate in Canadian history if she could give me sort of a brief summary of what exactly this rebellion entailed. And her description to me was, well, really what it was a bunch of angry drunk guys running around Toronto. So what this actually, when we break this down, I mean, she's not wrong. That's basically what it was. But there was a lot of resentment towards the government then. If there's a government, somebody's going to be angry about it, pretty much. So William Lyon Mackenzie was a political agitator, and he wanted to sort of overthrow Canada's parliamentary system, so the system that we have that follows the British model. He thought that the American democratic system was a better model for us to be following, and he got real mad about it. Got a bunch of other people sort of really worked up about this idea, and he and a bunch of his drunk friends sort of tried to invade Toronto. They didn't get very far with this. It was not a successful rebellion in the slightest, but it was still enough, and the unrest that was sort of that sort of came out of this rebellion was enough to concern the British government at the time. So they shipped a garrison of troops out from Halifax, Nova Scotia, out here to London, Ontario. And they settled them in a barracks that they created here in this spot in Victoria Park. So when they first got here in 1837, the first thing they had to do was actually clear this land. So this was all entirely what we would call virgin forest. So it had never been cleared before. They had to do that. And then they had to actually build the structure that they were supposed to be living in. So they erected the barracks themselves. It was up and running by about 1840. So from about 1840 to 1850, there was a British garrison here. So it had an infantry barracks. There was for the enlisted men, there was also officers' quarters for the officers and their families. So it wasn't just soldiers who was living here, it was their families as well. We think that there might have been a school that was associated with that, and there was other infrastructural things to support that. So that we know that the barracks, for example, had like a tailor and like a shoemaker associated to keep the men in clothing and in uniform. We also know that there was a canteen compound, and eventually there was a hospital compound that was built as well, sort of back towards Richmond Street. So this garrison was here until about 1853. At that point, it really seemed like there wasn't going to be too much more trouble. Like there wasn't the unrest had sort of calmed down, and also, you know, budget cuts. So they weren't really there didn't seem to be a need to support the expenditure of continuing to have a garrison here. However, since the building was still here through the 1854 through about 1859, it was actually used as a school compound for an interracial school supporting ex-slaves who had come into Canada from the US. So it was a school that was run by the church to sort of support the integration and learning of ex-slaves. And that was something that was here in Ontario, like in London, which I find really interesting. So that's not necessarily a story that we hear too much about our own history here in London. So just to know that those sorts of things were happening here, I think is pretty interesting. This didn't last, however. When we start to get into about the 1860s, we start to get into the period of unrest around the American Civil War. And while, you know, it was mostly an internal affair, there was concerns by the British that this might turn into something that would impact Upper Canada and this region that we now call Ontario. So they wanted to have a garrison here just in case. This was still very much a frontier kind of area, was not as settled. Our relationships with the United States are very different. The operation of our borders are very different as well. So there was some concern that the conflict in the States could lead to conflict up here as well, especially as there was sort of that anyway, there were concerns. So we won't get into too many of the details of that, but they did send another garrison. There was another about 2,000 men who were quartered here, again, in the infantry barracks in Victoria Park in that period. And we know that, you know, the Civil War didn't really spill out too much into Canada, so there wasn't too much for them to do in that regard. They were here to sort of help dissuade other kinds of unrest. So we knew that this was a period of the Fenian, I'm missing my words here, that they were a group of Irish Catholics, Irish Catholic Republicans. So they were fighting for the independence of Ireland from British control, and there were people in the United States who supported this cause and who took that fight sort of into Canadian grounds. And so there were raids into Canada from the States by the Fenians, and the British garrison here was to sort of help dissuade that kind of activity and to respond to it in this period. So once again, though, by about 1869, there wasn't really much more function that these troops were serving, and so the garrison was disbanded once again. And in that period is really when we start to see Victoria Park being developed as a park. So in 1871 is really when it gets its start. At that point in time, some of the local elites banded together to spend the money to start sort of a carriageway or a driveway for people to drive their carriages through this area. They planted a bunch of maple trees to sort of help beautify the area. And then there are some other contributions from maybe some less elevated members of society in the form of some arson, where they burned down both the infantry barracks and the officers' quarters as well, freeing this up to become the beautiful green grassland that we see today. So they all continue to plant native trees and so forth to beautify the area, to create more pathways for people to enjoy the beauty of the area. Throughout the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, so by 1912 we got the construction of the Boer War Memorial, which is just off here to my right. So that's when that comes in. There was also in the 1930s, there was more planning of the park itself, so there was more fountains put in, more walkways again, and so on and so forth. And then, as I said, it continued to be developed throughout the years. People still use this park. It has a very long history as a park. In fact, it is the oldest park public park in London. And then, as I was saying, in the 1990s, they wanted to sort of replace the aging bandstand that was there. That's where we get our first archaeological investigations, actually by ASI, Archaeological Services Inc. And then DR Poulton comes in when they bring in the park master plan in the late 90s to sort of develop what's here now. So what do we know about what was found here? So it was actually they were very impressed, especially when Poulton started doing their work in the area beyond the bandstand, to find just the level of detail of preservation in this area. So you can see a little bit on the, well, I hope you can see anyway, a little bit of the details in the plaque behind me. So you can actually see some of the foundation walls that were found here. So this was actually a cellar that was associated with the officers' barracks. And while we knew a lot about the about the barracks and the sort of the infantry base and presence here, there was a lot of details that the archaeological record was able to provide us that we didn't necessarily know all of the details about previously. So for example, some of the cellars that were found weren't on any of the plans. So you might have thought maybe the British were pretty good at, writing down what they were doing. They maybe missed a few details that archaeology was able to fill in. It also gave us a lot of information about the sort of things that people were using, so it gave us some of that material culture. So we're able to find a lot of uniform pieces, as you might imagine, so lots of buttons that show us the different regiments that were present and sort of where they were dispersed and how they were sharing space and interacting throughout the period that they were stationed here. We get a lot of shakos, so that was the kind of like the hat that was part of their uniform. It had a lot of like brass elements onto it. We find some of those as well as some of the chin straps. So lots of different sort of military uniform parts were found, but also a lot of like personal artifacts. So we find a lot of ceramics that were used. We can see in those, for example, the difference between sort of the officer level of lifestyle versus the enlisted men. We find a lot of like other personal items and like toothbrushes. We found, it was not the museum who was doing this. This was, again, it was DR Poulton and Associates Limited. They were the company that did a lot of this work, but they found, like I said, like hygiene products, like hair grease and all sorts of interesting things like toothbrushes, any sorts of personal like tools of that sort of thing that sort of aren't necessarily things that they would have been issued, but things that people would have acquired for themselves to use. We also find leisure items, so we find a lot of smoking pipes and really interesting ones that have been personalized once again, and things like dominoes and other kinds of game pieces that sort of reflect what these people were doing with their leisure hours. There's a lot of material that was found associated with the hospital. So we actually found some privies. So if you think about where the entrances are to Victoria Park, we've got sort of up in the northwest corner, the entrance off of Richmond. There were privies there that was associated with the officers' barracks. And then down in the southwest corner, so down at the entrance off of Wellington, there was privies there as well. And we found some more materials with, again, a lot of the stuff that was coming out that people were disposing of, basically throwing down the toilet shafts. We found the privies themselves, so again, it's giving us a little bit of an idea of the picture of like the hygiene that was supporting this sort of military complex that was here. We found also some elements of the hospital. So there was a hospital that was associated with us. It was sort of behind where we are now a little bit, but we did find some associated materials from that. Again, not we, I keep saying we, but it wasn't us. So Poulton found a lot of this They found, I believe, some of the foundations associated with the hospital, and some privies as well. And one of the interesting things I know that they found in the privies from the hospital was an amputated foot, or maybe two. So again, just sort of showing the perils perhaps of military life. One of the other things I think that was interesting that they found in the privies across the board was a lot of liquor bottles. And this is because the enlisted men weren't actually allowed to have liquor in their barracks, and so they would just stash them in the privies to go out and sneak a drink when they could. So, am I missing anything? So we found a lot of material items, so a lot of artifacts, and a lot of these different features that are associated with the military complex here as well. But a lot of the work that was done, as I was saying, was in response to the development of the park, the building of the pathways that we have now, putting in new entrances, and these sorts of developments. And so there's a lot of park areas that still have not been excavated, that still have a lot to tell us potentially about the history of this place and its archaeological footprint. So, and next time you're at Victoria Park, have a look around, maybe try and find some of the signs and read a little bit of details. There's one here about archaeology. I believe there's one as well that's focused on the integrated school I mentioned that was here in the mid 1850s. So just to give you a little bit an idea of the history of this place, and think about how, you know, in your use of the park, you're participating in that history today. And then just sort of enjoy. It's a beautiful spring day. There's lots of space in the park. You can keep your distance from people, still get a little bit of fresh air and exercise, and, you know, look forward with the rest of us to when our festival season resumes. So that's us for MOA Live Talks today. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments, and I or somebody else will hopefully be able to get back and answer those. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you.